Welcome, everybody. Today we are going to listen to Sebastián Moreno. He's from the University of Uruguay, Montevideo, where he teaches contemporary culture and society and international studies. His doctoral degree is in social sciences from the University of Munich in Germany. The title of his talk is The Semiotics of Contemporary Currency Design. So design is linked to banknotes and coins, but also adorn social discourses linked to state, nation, and cultural memory. The speaker will demonstrate how currency design is an activity shaped by cultural conventions. So before giving the word to him, I'm going to tell you the structure of this webinar. The speaker talks about 40 minutes. It can be a little bit more, no problem. And then I will call all the people who are on the panel one by one in any order. And you will have from 5 to 10 minutes to make your remarks and comments. And at the end, when all the panelists spoke, Sebastian will wrap up and answer all the questions all at once. Well, the word is with you, Sebastian.
Well, thank you very much, Monica, for agreeing to moderate the sessions. Thank you to all the panelists for agreeing to being here. It's very nice to see so many friends around and meeting new colleagues to discuss these kind of things, and particularly to Paul Zbigniew. Paul has been very generous since the very first time I met him in Thessaloniki in 2019 in one of the conferences of the Hellenic Semiotics Society. And since then, he has always opened doors for me and been very supportive with my research in the field of semiotics. This is what I'm going to present today. It's something that I'm working on. It's a book that will be launched the 27th of November of 2025, which is actually the date of my birthday. So it's an interesting coincidence. So I will share my screen. What I will try to do in these 14 minutes that I have. Let's see if you can see my screen. There we go. Can you see the screen? Can you see everything? Can you listen to me? Can you?
Yes.
So I will take the video for one moment until things settle down, because I imagine you see the semiotics, contemporary current. You don't see the full title, right? Or can you see the full?
I can see the full title.
Ah, perfect. Okay. Good. So there we are. This is the talk I'm going to present you during this webinar, the semiotics of contemporary currency design, and what I am trying to do here, as I will explain through the slides, is trying to propose a semiotic approach on how we can look at banknotes and coins to access the discourses shaping them besides economic discourse. It's clear that banknotes and coins are material objects, inventions that were created to store, express, and exchange economic value, but that could be done differently to what we have nowadays. Yeah. So at the end of the day, and I will start with this particular image. I hope you are seeing it. This is a photograph that I took personally in a pasticceria in Erice, a small town on a hill in Sicily, where every summer the group of semioticians from the University of Palermo organize a summer school on semiotic methodology. It's a classic. I had the opportunity of participating there twice. And every time I go to this pasticceria, which is a classic from the city, I see this wall and I think this is fantastic. right? So when we see things like this, and I assume everyone present here is familiar with this kind of ornamental use of banknotes and coins, particularly banknotes, but here you can see also how coins are sticked to the wall. We realize that actually these banknotes are not there for their economic purpose, and they are fulfilling a different type of function, which is much more linked to their art and how they look like than to what they are storing in terms of economics. So we'll turn. Oh, there we are. So when I speak of currency, yeah, this is an interesting debate. I'm thinking of banknotes and coins. The idea of currency is different from that of money from paper money as well. So it's an interesting debate. What is actually currency? Throughout history, we had different things functioning as currency, but nowadays what we use all around the world are banknotes and coins, and more normally, or in normal circumstances, coins and banknotes that are dependent on a national state. There is the exception of the euro, which is a supranational currency, but nevertheless it's regulated with the same authorities, a central bank, an executive power. So instead of talking of national currencies, we could think of currencies related to a political entity, a political community. To simplify, I will refer to nations, but this of course includes the euro as well. So approaching currency design from a semiotic perspective implies looking at a practice of enunciation where someone is creating specific texts of visual nature, which are the products. So what we try to do, and I will explain this a bit later when I speak of the methodological approach, we take the texts that circulate in everyday life and try to access the discourses shaping them through textual analysis. So when we get a banknote or a coin, we are looking at a carrier of meaning. There is something there which has signs on it, who someone chose and decided to include on the designs, and that we can approach as an expression, a visual substance or articulated in a particular way, expressing a specific content. And for me, the interesting question here is, which is the content that is being expressed? So when we look at the dimension of the content, we tend to see very intuitively, thanks to the discursive genre of currency design, but also because we are familiar with how, for example, the euro works or different currencies work, we know that we are facing discourses of national identity or statehood enunciated by the state. So every state as a political organization, to construct their identity, produces national symbols, highlights or celebrates national heroes. There are traditions considered to be national, and among many other elements that serve to construct and legitimate the state, we have currency. And interestingly enough, in currency, we will usually find all these kind of national symbols, national heroes, and national traditions. When looking at currency design, at banknotes and coins, we will also tap on cultural memory. As we all know, it's a topic of a lot of interest for sociocultural semioticians. The idea that memory and how societies and what societies remember is stored and circulates in specific texts, and the creation of those texts, what is remembered, what is forgotten and left aside from official discourse, is also meaningful. So as we shall see in the case of the Argentinian peso, which is one of the currencies I will be tapping on later, there are disputes about the iconographic content to use in currency design, depending on the view that the people in power on a particular time have about what it means to be Argentinian, Brazilian, and so on and so on. Right? Good. So a couple of questions that I will try to address or that have guided my research are, number one, what idea, image, identity of the national state is conveyed in currency? Yeah? What do we know about currency when we look at a specific currency? which are the encyclopedias used in currency design and why. The idea is trying to explain why in Brazil, for example, the government decided that using an effigy of the Republic, which is a classic figure standing for a political concept, was a good idea, whereas in Switzerland, in the newest designs, as we shall see in a moment, there is a symbolic idea about what it means to be Swiss, for example, through actions and specific themes. How do these encyclopedias relate to each other, and how can currency be used as a locus for political, ideological, or partisan struggle? So this is a bit what I will try to do, what I have been trying to do now for a couple of years when preparing the book on currency design. That, of course, is at the base of what I'm presenting. The question, simply put, is how, and I will concentrate now on banknotes because I think they are more interesting for this type of visual presentation than coins. But of course, the idea is that we can apply whatever I will be trying to share with you also to coins. How do we go from an empty piece of paper, or actually a fabric, that we call paper, but it hasn't been paper for a long time. Now, a lot of banknotes, for example, the Canadian ones, are made in polymer, which is a plastic substance, and before, some still survive as a combination of cotton and linen, right? So this kind of question is what called my attention, and the task of socio-cultural semioticians, or semioticians working with cultural discourse and with cultural issues, is try to explain how culture, discourse, memory, history, ideology mediate in how or societies design this kind of material objects. So I'm going to try to turn on the camera now. It should be fine. I hope you can listen to me. And if it's breaking, please let me know so it's. So as a starting point, scholarship on currency and currency design, and particularly national currencies, is active since the 1990s. The decade of the 1990s saw a small boom in scholarship on currency design, particularly by cultural geographers publishing articles on the journal Political Geography. This is related, of course, to the fall of overarching political structures like the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia. When these structures collapse, new nations need to come up with their national symbology, and many of them had to create new currencies. Or if they decided to reuse the names of previous currencies, now they had to redesign them. So there was a very interesting moment, or the 90s were a very interesting moment for people interested in these kind of things. Of course, the focus of this scholarship is beyond the economic dimension. We know that in semiotics, many, Christian Banco, here part of the panel, have thought about money and currency as a sign system. What are the logics or the relationships between the economic signs and reality of the social dimension? But in the case of scholarship on currency design, people who studied currencies were interested particularly in cultural issues, in society, how currency expresses different ways of conceiving the nation, and identity. And of course, the socio-cultural semiotic approach I am trying to propose here draws on this previous research. So these people have argued that currency design is an expression of national identity, but they have not particularly studied which are the signs, why these signs are meaningful, which are the isotopies that we can find on banknotes and coins, and so on. And this is what I'm trying to do with my research. And one interesting idea that I found in this previous scholarship is that when we speak of nationalism or national identity, we normally think of the state as an agent, yes, an entity with agency. But actually the idea or the proposal is that since states have a lot of levels of agency, it's better to think of the state as an idea, as a chain of agents, and in the case of semioticians, we could think of it as a pole of enunciation. Actually, the state creates banknotes and coins, but there are so many people involved, the central bank, the government eventually, committees, parliamentary committees who approve of the designs, the technical designers, those working with the security features. So there are a lot of people involved there, and the idea is that we avoid thinking of the state as an agent. I am presenting here a couple of books books on scholarship just as a reference. We have The Making of National Money by Eric Helleiner from the late 90s, an edited volume by Emily Gilbert and Eric Helleiner from also the late 90s, Nation, States, and Money. There is a very interesting PDF book by Hans de Heij, who works at the Dutch Central Bank, that is called Designing Banknote Identity, where he maps different strategies. It's a very interesting book. Specific contributions or analysis like The Greenback by Austrian professor Heinz Schachler, who also, it's very interesting because he takes the US dollar and applies a culturalist perspective to understand the meanings that circulate in these material objects. And there were as well, since banknotes and coins are somehow artistic works or pieces of art, but there are a couple of books, and I here bring 3 examples because from the cover you can already see that these are typically the typical design books that someone would put on the living room table to as a decoration. We see how the artistic dimension also was interesting, particularly by Virginia Hewitt, who was affiliated to the Bank of England, if I am not mistaken. So from drawing on this particular or this research strand from the 90s and from the 2000s and 2010s, I try to approach currency design as a discursive genre. If we think of genres, actually we're thinking of more or less codified ways of producing texts. And this is what happens in currency design. No one expects, or it's very hard that we can think of a banknote that is circular, right? Or that is triangular. When we think of banknotes, we think of a rectangular shape. If they are used horizontally or vertically, that's a different story, but we don't think of banknotes that are like that. So when we start making like an initial mapping of the features of that or the characteristics of that discursive genre, we see, for example, the use of color, which is normally used to give banknotes an identity and to distinguish them from each other within a system. We will see this in concrete examples in a while. We always encounter different designs on front and reverse. So I haven't encountered banknotes who have the same design on both sides. So there is like a or a relationship between a front and a reverse, which normally is also a thematic relationship, right? When we find a person on the front side of a banknote, normally on the back, we find something related to that person. For example, a battle where he or she was involved, or an artwork, or an invention, and so on. Also, in terms of what is standard in the genre, we find one main figure or character per banknote. This has changed, of course, in the last couple of years, but normally we encounter one person, either the reigning monarch, an animal, someone, a past president, or so on. We will see this now. And we also know that when we find a human feature on a banknote or a coin, we know that this person existed. And this is very interesting because we could think, for example, of a world where a national state decides to use on currency iconography fictional characters from novels, for example, from those the considered national novels. And also generic roles. I will show you in a while an interesting case from Paraguay, where there is a banknote dedicated to the Paraguayan woman in general. Women from Paraguay, they are celebrated on banknotes, and it's not a particular person that is being depicted, but a generic role. The focus is normally set on the past, not in the present and not in the future. And what we find, and this is the interesting thing for us semioticians, is the semantic universes we encounter in currencies. And if we work with some oppositions, for example, the cultural and the natural, which is, of course, an analytical opposition, just to try to understand if what we are seeing in a banknote is human-made or not, or it's pre-human, the human and the animal, the classic and modern. And I will try to illustrate all these intuitions or ideas with specific analysis. And finally, we will encounter things related to national heritage, spaces, artworks, buildings, inventions, epochs, events, and so on. So we can expect to find things on the banknotes of a particular political community that relate to the idea of the nation and national identity. Good. So the semiotics of currency design, there in my approach to this object of study, I have drew on three key concepts: that of text, discourse, and the semiosphere. So text for semioticians are anything that is more or less close and has an internal articulation. So we can approach banknotes and coins as visual texts. They are clearly delimited by a frame, and within the surface of the frame, we can clearly identify elements and identify the discontinuities that are meaningful. The proposal here, following Eliseo Verón and his trends of sociocultural semiotics, is that through text analysis, we can access some force that is invisible or is not directly accessible, that is discourse, the domain of worldviews, of ideology, of axiologization, of values, and so on, and the idea that all these texts and the discursive force are embedded on a semiosphere. Yeah, the idea of semiosphere introduced by Yuri Lodman, based on the idea of the biosphere, is that we human beings are embedded in spheres where text and signs circulate, and these texts are organized following a certain hierarchy. There are things that are closer or more relevant to the core, and so on, and others that are more peripheral. And if we use the concept of the semiosphere to refer to national identities, we think of the Uruguayan semiosphere, the Greek semiosphere, the Bulgarian semiosphere, we are trying to understand sets of relationships that relate texts and that produce meaning that people can identify with. So in analytical terms, besides these three concepts, I have drawn on visual semiotics and the idea of a figurative semiotics, the plastic dimension of semiosis, the styles used, for example, for fonts. Why does the Bank of England use a calligraphy that looks like very delicate and curvy, like handwritten, while the United States decides to use an all-cap stylization of the full name of the country, the United States of America, with bold and like a very solid presence? The type of signs, are we seeing signs that are iconic, that are symbolic, and so on? And besides the visual semiotic dimension, which would be enough for semioticians' interest in visual things, describing what's going on banknotes and coins is enough. But I am interested in trying to understand, as mentioned in the first bullet point of this slide, trying to understand what I am seeing in the text that I find in banknotes and coins are meaningful within a semiosphere and express particular discourse, and how they relate to other discourses. Yeah? And I will try to say something on this in the case of Brazil, which is very interesting, because the figure we encounter as the main character for in every banknote of the Brazilian real since 1994 is an allegory, is the idea of the republic, which is a very interesting idea within the independent Portugal. So when I had a banknote or a set of banknotes, when I had my corpus, the first part of the analysis would consist on format, layout, and style. Are the banknotes similar to each other? Do they look like a family of banknotes and coins? Are they used horizontally or vertically? What's going on with the security strips and features? The style, do they look old? Do they look new? I will show this in a moment, looking at the US dollar. Then the second point is related to validity and legality. So every banknote has signatures, some seals, some stamps, ID numbers, identification numbers, serial numbers, things that make it be the material object that they have to be, right? And in the third and fourth place...
ପଠେଇ ସାରିଲେଣି ସେଇଟା? ଓହୋ, ଆଚ୍ଛା, ହଉ ହଉ। ମୁଁ ଭାବୁଥିଲି ଗୋଟେ ଲାଇନ୍ ଯୋଡ଼ିବା ପାଇଁ, ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ମଲ୍ଟିଲିଙ୍ଗୁଆଲ ଏଜୁକେସନ କଥା କହୁନୁ, it will create a homogeneous symbiotic linguasphere for India. ଯେମିତି ଆମେ ଏଟମୋସ୍ଫିୟର ବାୟୋସ୍ଫିୟର ସବୁ ୟୁଜ କରୁନୁ, ସେମିତି ଖାଲି ଭାବୁଥିଲି ଯେ କଣ ଟିକେ ଯୋଡି ଟିକେ ମାନେ ହେଲେ ଟିକେ ଆଟ୍ରାକ୍ଟିଭ ହବ, ଗୋଟେ ନୂଆ ଲୋକ ଭାବେ ଆଚ୍ଛା ହଁ ବାୟୋସ୍ଫିୟର, ଏଟମୋସ୍ଫିୟର, ସେ ଅମକୋସ୍ଫିୟର ସମକୋସ୍ଫିୟର। ଆଚ୍ଛା, ହଉ, ଠିକ ଅଛି ଆପଣ
There we are. Svigny, I don't know if you're there, Svigny, but I'm trying to mute Panshanan, and I couldn't. Are we still there? Monica, can you hear me? Everything fine? Perfect.
Fine.
Yeah. Okay. I tried to silence Panshanan, who didn't realize his microphone was open. So in the third and fourth points, that's where the interesting things come for us semioticians, is we look at the state identity, how the identity of the state is expressed on banknotes and coins, and I will show you particular examples now. And finally, the most interesting or fun part are the other contents. Besides the validity and legality, serial number, economic value, the name of the institution behind the banknote, and so on, there are some signs, there are some signs and identities. So something happened with my screen. I apologize for that. What's going on? So I stop sharing and I will reshare. Let's see if this works. So there we are, right? Christian Uribe, as I see you now on my screen, you listen, you can hear me and you can, okay, sorry
Yes.
for that. What is a webinar without this kind of technical issues? So, and finally, the other contents, for some reason, at some point, the Brazilian government decided that besides the Republic on the front side, they wanted to include animals from the national fauna on the back. And for some reason, the Argentinian government, the one before Javier Milei, decided that the animals that the previous government had chosen were not a good iconography for banknotes, and they decided to reinstaurate battles and moments of, and so on and so on. And there is where we can find, of course, this discourse in action, and not forgetting that these things are political, that these things are part of political discourse, and that currency, banknotes and coins can be used for this kind of political adversativity, and an idea proposed by Veron, and that also we find in Chantal. So now I won't bother you with so much text, and I will try to present some examples. In my screen, you are seeing the 7 banknotes currently circulating of the United States dollar. In the US, banknotes are valid forever. Yeah, if you come from a bank with a banknote that is very old, that is not emitted anymore, you can still use it. This doesn't happen in other countries. Yeah? Uruguay, for example, is a country that has the Uruguayan peso as a national currency, but the dollar, the US dollar, is used for other stuff, for bigger stuff. If you want to buy a property, if you want to buy a car, if you want to buy a computer, an iPhone, you will pay this with US dollars. And normally the design shapes or conditions if the dollars will be accepted or not by the payee. So the dollar of the $100 with Benjamin Franklin you are seeing on the screen now is the one that is accepted in Uruguay. If you come with the version from the 1 and 2 series, or the series to which the 1 and 2 banknotes belong, no one will take that. So design elements also relate to the circulation of currency, but this is not something I am very much interested in my research. When looking at the front sides of the US dollar, the first thing we see is that we have 2 different visual systems. One that is much more modern, contemporary, that highlights the main characters in a way that looks very close to our time, that is more squared, is not so baroque as I call the banknotes of 1 and 2. These are designed. These were designed already between 1914 and 1929, so it's 1 century ago, and we can see here what Eliseo Verón calls the conditions of production. Yeah, according to Verón, when a text is analyzed, we need to take into account which are the things going on in the semiosphere at the time of the creation of the text that are incorporated in the designs. So the type of shapes and curvy things that remind me a lot to Art Nouveau or this kind of European design is something that it's harder to find in a banknote that was designed in 2015 or 2010, because that style is regarded as old. classic, as something from the past. And we can see this change. And the only fact, or the fact itself, that we see this change in the 7 banknotes of the US dollar that coexist nowadays is already meaningful, because for some reason, someone decided that, leaving aside this guilloche, I think the name in French of this style, or guilloche, is to abandon it. If you look at it, we see like plants or things that look a bit exotic in the one dollar banknote. All this was removed from the other banknotes. In terms of content, we see 7 men that we very quickly identify as belonging to the collective of the founding fathers, which is a foundational myth of the United States. The group of men, they were not 7, they were much more, but the idea is that these people were the subject, they were the actor, the people who helped the United States become an independent nation state. If we go to the backs, before that, the type of depiction we see, and this is very interesting because we are seeing copies of copies, right? On the $10 note, currently we see Alexander Hamilton, and what we see is that the image we find on the banknote is a copy from a portrait that artist John Trumbull painted from the real Hamilton, probably. So this idea of the degrees of copy is very interesting because the type of representation changed, right? The portrait, what we see, the Hamilton we see in the portrait painted by Trumbull is much more realistic, much more iconic than the copy that we are seeing on the back. But if we go to the back designs, and I apologize for the pixelation, I didn't realize the quality wasn't so good, we see a lot of buildings, with the except of the $1 banknote, which has a very interesting iconography that I won't analyze here. We see that on the 5, 10, 20, 50, and 100, we find the Capitol building, the Independence Hall, the Lincoln Memorial, the White House. Buildings that are not occupied by people. These buildings are there for a reason. They express the state identity. They are not because of the architectural value they might have, because they are pretty buildings. They are buildings because they are concrete material outputs or products resulting from the nation as an independent state. So we have people, which are all men and statesmen on the front. We have buildings related to the state on the back, and there is an interesting exception in the 2 US dollar banknotes. This is the only banknote in whose reverse we encounter a group of men doing something. This is the only event we find. That is, of course, the Declaration of Independence from 1776. So this is a very basic approach I'm trying to do. In the book, I'm explaining this with a bit more detail. But when looking at currency design in the case of the United States, we encounter a group of men who were statesmen, and we can realize that already in the formality of the attire as well. These people are mythified because we don't see the name Benjamin Franklin. We only see a label on the bottom with the name Franklin. So we all should know who this Franklin is. And in the back, we have the moment of relevance that justifies all the iconography and the discourse of the nation. It's the Declaration of Independence, right? So when we go to the Canadian dollar, again, I apologize for the quality of these images. In Canada, currently there are these 5 banknotes. They are being redesigned. I will say something on this later. But we have 5 people, 4 of them men, 4 of them prime ministers. So the matrix, the producing matrix is the same. These people are highlighted or featured on banknotes because they had something to do with the state, with the national state. The Queen as well, this is a peculiar figure, and this shows how the designs of the Canadian dollar oscillate between the pole of the local Canadian independent and the dependent from the Commonwealth and monarchy and so on. The interesting thing is that these 5 or the 4 men that are depicted on banknotes of the Canadian dollar are much more contemporary than the people we saw in the US, right? And when we look, for example, at what's going on in Canada nowadays, you will see, for example, on the left the part of the screen, you see 4 different editions or 4 different series of the 10 Canadian dollar banknotes depicting former Prime Minister MacDonald. Yeah, he, since I think 1958 or something like that, he has been the main character of the 10 Canadian dollar banknotes. In 2010, the Bank of Canada decided to change the design, and we see how the bank decided to maintain the color, the violet color, the purple color, because it's a way of giving each banknote an identity in chromatic terms, but the iconography is completely modified. We don't have a statesman anymore. We don't have a man anymore. We have a woman. We don't have a statesman anymore. We have a woman who was an activist for social rights. She was an entrepreneur, someone in the business who fought for social inclusion. We don't have a white man anymore. Viola Desmond was black. And we see also that this kind of disruption is also expressed in how the banknote is used for design. Traditionally, Canadian banknotes were used horizontally. Traditionally, we had the same person jumping from one series to the other. All of a sudden, this is changed. And of course, this is meaningful. For us people trying to understand how meaning works in society, we cannot ascribe a meaning or an intention to this discontinuity, right? Here, the idea of continuity and discontinuity is very important, because what is motivating this? If we continue with the Canadian dollar, and thank Paul, because the last time we met, he gave me a real $5 Canadian dollar banknote, which allowed me to see it very closely. If we look at the $5 Canadian dollar banknote, we see that how things have moved in the mid 20th century. On the upper left part of my screen, you see that the design was a pristine and bucolic landscape. It was the landscape of nature, a wood, whatever. In the next series, we also have the idea of nature, the sea, and things that are used to characterize Canada as a geographical entity. But now we see human activity. There are fishermen. There are people doing things with the landscape, with the Canadian territory. In the previous to last series of the Canadian dollar, we see children playing hockey or people walking on the snow. And finally, in the current 5 Canadian dollars banknote, we find space. And this is very uncommon, right? It's very uncommon to find such modern content. I need to stop here with the Canadian dollar, but it's very interesting how things evolved from an original, pristine, bucolic, naturalistic take of Canadian landscape as a way of justifying or constructing national identity towards something that is much related to innovation and frontiers and producing things that are different. Curiously, if you look at the $5 Canadian dollar banknotes, you will see that the astronauts are somehow standing, let's say, in the thanks to perspective, on the Earth, and Canada is depicted from a satellite image. And this is very interesting because it's not common at all in the genre of currency design. Moving now, if we go to the pound sterling, these are the new designs of the pound sterling, and on the front side, every single of the 4 banknotes of the pound sterling feature the reigning monarch. When Queen Elizabeth passed away, a lot of things changed, of course, but banknotes and coin iconography as well. The Bank of England had to redesign and start coming with designs to remove the figure or the portrait of the Queen from banknotes and replace it with the portrait of the King. On the back side, we encounter this. Winston Churchill, Jane Austen, Turner, the painter Turner, and Alan Turing. So these people that we have not encountered so far, because we saw statesmen, prime ministers, moments of declaration of independence, now we see a politician and intellectual, we see a writer. Jane Austen was a writer, nothing to do with the state, absolutely no relation with the state. Turner, the same, and Alan Turing. Yeah, so here new universes enter, and these universes usually consist of scientists, people who somehow contributed to the nation with their creativity, with artwork, and so on. I will stop 1 second. I will go back, sorry, to the £5 banknote. If you see below on the left, there is a small stamp. That is the stamp of the Bank of England, where you see an image of Britannia. Yeah, and I want to say something about Britannia because the 4 banknotes include an image of Britannia. You can see the one in the £50 banknote on the top left of my screen. Britannia was used as well on the £2 coin before the King Charles redesign. And in the past, she was used as well as an iconographic. And this is very interesting because we are encountering personifications and allegorical anthropomorphic characters. Britannia is an idea that originates in classicism. The British Islands have been designed with the figure or the name Britannia forever. But what we encounter here are two different representations or approaches to Britannia. One is Britannia's a warrior wearing a helmet, holding a trident, and a different one. So we see this image in the upper banknote and in the lower coin. But the other one is Britannia as someone peaceful. That's what we find in the Bank of England. We find a woman sitting down, holding a spear, not a trident, her shield next to her. She's not at all aggressive, and she is offering an olive branch, which we know is conventionally a sign of peace. In the lower banknote, you see the same depiction. There is Britannia sitting down. So we have two Britannias. Britannia as an idea is the same, but there are two modulations of Britannia. So for banking purposes, obviously, the second one is the one that works, because banking is an activity based on trust, on reliability, on solidity, and on dialogue, of course. And that's why this kind of thing, so someone choosing to include a warrior like Britannia or a more peaceful Britannia is something interesting to analyze. On the pound sterling, another interesting thing is the institutional presence of the state. The banknotes and coins of the pound sterling don't say anything about the United Kingdom. They don't include the name. So the only signature we find is that of the Bank of England and the presence of the constituent nations of the United States. If you look at the main side, I don't know if we are technically allowed to cut banknotes, but I did it. You find this curvy shape with four coats of arms of the four shields of Wales, England, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And if you look at the current £2 coin and the previous £1 coin, you find the resource to the nations of the United Kingdom through the symbol of the national flower. So all these things are very interesting because all this information about the nation is contained here. When we look at the banknotes and coins of the pound sterling, we are looking at a monarchic type of discourse, the reigning monarch as the main figure, but we are not disacknowledging the fact that this kingdom is composed of four national identities that are equally respected. Brazil. The case of Brazil, I advanced this before. Here we have there is one banknote missing, that is the newest banknote of 200 reais. On the front side, Brazil decided in 1994 to depict an effigy of the Republic. I'm sorry about the quality, but if you can see this doesn't look like a person. You know Marianne, the idea of the Republic, already in the 19th century, or perhaps before. I will ask Leah afterwards for more details on this. But we have the figure circulating in French circles, in European circles, which were very impactful in Latin American independence struggles. And at some point, someone decided, okay, we will celebrate the 100 years of the Republic, of the Brazilian independence from the empire, by highlighting the Republic. So instead of having an anthropomorphic creation, this image, this portrait we see is like a Greek bust, like a statue. She looks like a statue wearing the crown of laurels and the Phrygian cap. So this is completely different to what we saw before. Yeah? And there is an amazing book, I think it's only in Portuguese, by José Murillo de Carvalho, which is called The Formation of Souls. And he explains how in Brazil, at the time of independence, there were liberal, positivist, and Republican clashes or discursive forces trying to fight over the new definition of the independent state. And finally, Republicanism won this kind of discursive struggle. And that's why we nowadays see the idea of the Republic highlighted on banknotes and coins. We have then the Swiss franc, which is also a very interesting thing. I begin with the right? We saw Britannia, we saw the idea of the Republic, and we see in coins of the Swiss franc, Helvetia, the anthropomorphic representation of the nation, of the national state, the Swiss Confederation or the Helvetic Confederation. But in terms of banknotes, it's very interesting because banknotes from the latest series of the Swiss franc, which are the ninth series, if I am not mistaken, are fully vertical. Yeah, I have not encountered this in any other system. We have normally you have one side vertical and the other horizontal, as I will show in the Argentinian case. But here they decided for that. Besides, given Switzerland's political culture, where you don't have big figures in power, you have one president, you have a concilium of a group of presidents that rotate every year, so that every canton and the cantonal dimension is not eaten up by the federal dimension. When the Swiss National Bank decided to launch a competition for new designs, they proposed that what they wanted to express was the national soul, not highlighting people. People are not allowed. We don't want to have artists, mathematicians, inventors, and so on, as was the case in past series. We want to express values. So it's very interesting to read the brief that the graphic designers had to work with, and the final results. This is something I analyze with detail in the book, and I won't bore you with that because we don't have much time. Yeah, but we see a completely different universe from anything we have encountered so far in currency design. Again, here we have the case of the Norwegian kroner. Yeah, if we look at the banknotes from the previous series, they look like traditional banknotes, different colors, value, a discrete background, and one person looking at us or highlighted with a big portrait. The new designs of the kroner are completely different. We find things that are new, that are very innovative. If we think of the $1 banknotes of the United States, or if we look at the banknotes of the past series of the kroner that we see on the left of the screen, we can identify something that is classic, traditional, what we expect to find in currency. But when we look at what we are seeing on the right, a lighthouse highlighted as the main design element of a banknote, and on the back, a very complex and modernist, or whatever the style may be, type of depiction. This is also meaningful, right? Because here it's not about nature and culture or about past and present. It's about the image of the state being conveyed by these things. When we look at the kroner, Norwegian kroner, or the Swiss franc banknotes, we think of something very up to date, very young, very contemporary, as opposed to all those designs that many other nations still use that are much more older and also convey an idea. The euro, yeah, I will talk about the euro and eventually the Argentinian peso. The euro we know or not, but I think it's broadly know that these doors or windows and bridges represented in the banknotes of the euro do not exist. They were created deliberately to symbolize openness, connection, and dialogue, and that these were created out of the blue. Yeah, so the designers tasked with creating the euro in the late 90s came up with this proposal, and we know then that this supranational identity, for which it's very hard to express particular values, or not, because we could think of the European Union featuring Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, or the popes or the founders of the European Union on banknotes and coins, but this has been left aside. Currently, the euro is being redesigned. There is a consultation process to change the designs of the euro. And if I'm not mistaken, there were two main themes that were selected. One is rivers of Europe, and the other one is culture of Europe. So in general, like music, visual arts, and so on. So I'm curious to see what we will find on the new designs of banknotes and coins. An interesting thing of the euro is that normally on currency design, we find reflections, representations, or creations that reflect things that happened in the world. In this case, we don't, but curiously, there is a small town in the Netherlands who decided to create or recreate the bridges that are featured on the back side of the euros on a canal that is surrounding the town. So these are the pictures from those bridges, which in addition were painted with the colors of the notes, right? So on the left, the first image you see on the screen from left to right is a 200 euro, the bridge we find in the 200 euro banknote, which is colored with green. Then you have the pink one that I don't think is the friendliest color to paint a bridge, but then we have this reference as well by the decision originating in currency that the 500 euro banknote is pink. Another interesting thing from the euro are the coins. In the cents euros, so the units 1, 2, and 5, we find a depiction of Europe that is related to Asia and to Africa. You can see on the little globe that Europe is depicted in a particular way. In the 10, 20, and 50, we find a different representation of Europe. This is an old design, which was criticized and replaced. In the old design, you could see more or less the shapes, the limited shapes of the countries that were part of the Union, yeah, and you see that there between France, Germany, and Italy, Switzerland is not there. It's a void, so there's a little void. And in the 1 and 2 euros, you find an idea of Europe as a unit. So all these things, again, that might be invisible to people holding the coins, are meaningful. They signify, they express particular visions of European integration, of Europe, the EU, and so on. So I want to comment, and I will avoid the Argentinian case because I'm already talking too much, but I want to comment a couple of exceptions or things that are interesting. Yeah, the Brazilian real, I already mentioned. Here the quality is good, but you see that we have like a bust or a classic statue being depicted. To the right below, we see the newest designs of the Bolivian peso. Yeah, Bolivia, under Evo Morales, changed its political structure. They insist very much with the idea of a plurinational state to acknowledge for ethnic diversity. And the new designs try to express this identity, featuring 3 people per banknote. So when I work, this is not contained in the book because the chapter would have been eternal, but I wrote a paper on this. And when we analyze the people featured on Bolivian banknotes, we have to deal with, it's like an orchestra. So many people that trying to understand who they are, what they stand for, why were they chosen, and so on. And above, we see an old 1,000 guilder banknote from the Netherlands before it changed to the euro in the early 2000s, where we see a depiction of Baruch Spinoza, which is very interesting as well, because this is not the standard iconic, mimetic, photographic depiction we see. There is something artistic. We can recognize Spinoza. We know this is Spinoza, thanks to some cultural codification, but of course we see the mediation of the artist there, and this is something original as well. Finally, on the upper right part of the screen, I mentioned the case before. This is the Paraguayan 20,000 guaraníes banknote, where we see a woman holding a jar, and below, you don't see it there, but it says the Paraguayan woman. So this banknote is not celebrating that particular woman who probably existed and was used as a token for a type. Yeah, she is one particular woman that is going to be featured on banknotes and the banknotes to celebrate women from Paraguay who had a very hard time in the history of the country, and this is also not very common to see. I will skip Argentina because otherwise I'm talking too much, but as a way of conclusions, and I'm already very much looking forward to your comments and particularly ideas you might have to make this more interesting. Banknotes and coins are texts that are embedded in a semiosphere and expressing discourse. Yeah, that's why text, semiosphere, and discourse are very closely related in this semiotic approach to currency. When we work with the plane of content, we are looking at the distinctive national and state identities. Yeah, but the question is, which identity? Is it the politically military identity? Is it the natural geographical identity? Are we talking about cultural? Are we talking about what the national identity leaves behind, for example, innovations, work of arts, and so on? So what we see here from the pole of enunciation is an arbitrary selection, and it's ideology-based. The Central European Central Bank is now redesigning the euro, and we can expect the choices to have proposed for consultation to be based on a particular stance of people in power at the time. Yeah? The same in Argentina. Yeah? Recently, a 20,000 Argentinian peso banknote was, you see it below, was issued. And this was issued by the government of Javier Milei, who is a radical, a libertarian, very critical with the previous government. And he left aside some of the original designs proposed by the previous government to the new Argentinian peso. Yeah, so these kind of struggles work. So that's why I insist with this idea of the conditions of production proposed by Eliseo Verón, the great Argentinian semiotician in the 80s. Whenever we look at text and discourse, let's not forget that texts are not in a void. Yeah, the immanent approach is fantastic. We can try to express how texts signify what's going on, the levels. We can apply the whole gray mass theory, but for things like currency, we cannot forget that these are instruments for political discourse and might express worldviews and visions. And the plane of expression, that is the working matter we have, we find units belonging to the local encyclopedia considered as national. Yeah, this idea is there are many nations in the world. We, the Uruguayans, have a particular local encyclopedia that is different from the one from Brazil, for example. If we look at our Uruguayan writers, it's going to be different to those we will find in the banknotes of the Brazilian real from previous series, like Machado de Assis, Mario de Andrade, etc. And what we see in the plane of expression, by the very fact of something being depicted on currency, is a mythification, a process of mythification. If something is depicted on currency, which is an official discourse produced by the state, the very fact of that element being depicted there already mythifies it. It gives a status that perhaps it doesn't have in the everyday lives of people. So what we encounter here is a discourse of national identity that is enunciated by the state, that is official, that is formal, but that circulates in everyday context. And here the idea of banal nationalism, which was introduced in 1995 by social psychologist Michael Billig, is interesting, because whenever I open my wallet and go somewhere to pay in Uruguay with a 1,000 Uruguayan pesos banknote, I am encountering something about the discourses of the nations. So a couple of questions that I remain open also for discussion are the following. Which elements of the local encyclopedia are selected, by whom and why? Which connotations are these elements expected to evoke in the citizenry, and which do they actually evoke? This is something very interesting to really understand what people feel and think about the designs of banknotes. I don't think this is something semioticians can do, because you need to implement instruments that are outside our discipline, but this reception stance on currency design would be very interesting. How are the design elements used politically? What is the relationship that exists with other discourses of national identity, either hegemonic or emergent ones? The case of Canada with the minorities, with multiculturalism, and so on is very interesting, because we see how for the first time in decades now a minority, both because she's a woman, because she's black, and so on, is represented on banknotes. Yeah, and of course how emergent discourses like feminism, minorities, and so on emerge, and which are the contested elements that we find on banknotes and coins. I hope I hadn't bored you. I thank you very much for your attention. This is the cover of the book. The book is still not ready, but we have a cover. So I am very much looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the interesting and insightful talk. So let's start with the panelists. I'll call Roman Izquierda from the Universidad Autónoma de México, and he's a specialist in cognitive neurosciences linked to semiotics of design and marketing.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you very much, Sebastian. It was very, very interesting. Well, I find a lot of ideas in your talk, so I'll try to pull some of your ideas to my own field. I'm working a lot with politicians here in Mexico. And of course, today's most important subject is Donald Trump and the way he's treating Canada and Mexico. As Paul Busak asked me at the beginning of our talk, he asked me, are you suffering the taxes already? Because Donald Trump imposed taxes on us. And I think it is very interesting. I was quite surprised to see the way you analyzed the currency. And I think it would be very interesting to follow how, in a broader context, all the currency is produced by certain cognitive frames. For example, as I'm sure you all know, George Lakoff pointed out that in the United States, there are like two big political frames: the strict father model and the Northern father model. So the strict father is related to Republicans in the States, and the Northern father is related to the Democrats. And of course, there's a lot of flow between them, right? But with the arrival of Donald Trump, we see this strict father figure. Donald Trump himself is this big guy, American guy, big, and he's very imposing. So in this new presidency, he started by hitting everyone, and he was like, I am going to tell you what I'm going to do, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to impose taxes to Mexico and to Canada. And this strict father figure is very interesting because, as Lakoff says, this is something that operates subconsciously. And when I saw the dollars that you showed us, if you see the back panel or the back side of the dollar currency, you see these buildings, which are strong, architectural. The composition is always central, and they're very, very strong, like here it is. And in the main side, the father figures of America, men, strong contrast between the figure and the background. You see, I think it's the only currency that has this very strong contrast between the main figure and the light colors of the background. One of the things that shocked me when I went the first time to Finland was to find that Finnish currency had all these architects, musicians, and not like in Mexico, we have all these traditional heroes of, like political, traditional warriors figures. And it was so contrasting to see the way Finland represented itself in the currency to artists than the ones we used in Mexico. So it's very interesting because I think there's something kind of subconscious going on there. Like we need to portray our country as a strong, and the governments of this country are strong, solid father figures. And when you go to other countries, and as you showed us in, I think it's the Netherlands, the one that breaks the format and goes vertically with a woman, a very beautiful.
Canada, is the new
Canada.
Canada.
That's Canada. Yeah, that's Canada. You see, that makes you think of something completely different. See, they break the law. The law is most currencies horizontal. And when you see other countries, perhaps you can find some subconscious kind of representation of another way of being and not being like everyone else. And I don't know, I think it's quite interesting. Some other of the examples you showed us don't show this strict contrast. Well, Canada as well, they have these landscapes instead of people, instead of heroes, and landscapes are much more flexible in the visual composition. So they seem to metaphorize another way of being, like soft, natural, culturally different from this kind of traditional American strong man figure. So I don't know if that can be of some help for your book, which I know it's very, very advanced, but for me it was very, very fascinating to see all these differences. Thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thank you very much. Now let's hear Leah Ioka from the Aristotle University in Thessalonica, Greece. She's a professor of art history and visual semiotics.
Thank you very much, Monica Rector. And thank you, Sebastian, for giving me the opportunity to ask you a few questions about your really interesting project. I'm inviting you to present it in Thessaloniki next year when it's more advanced, perhaps, when the book is out, when you've done a few presentations, perhaps you'll find your tools more. I have a question on the basic premise of the book. And I also have to ask, before I pose the question itself, whether you are still working on the conclusions. Because if so, then the following thoughts might be useful. Yeah? You are still working on it? Fantastic.
A quick question, a comment on this. In my previous experience, you are still working on the conclusions until the publisher says no more. You still modify the PDF already, the proofs.
Yes, great. And I really like the previous commentator's idea that Donald Trump, for example, could impose a new iconography on the currency, and I would still see no difference in his politics. So this is my main point. I think banknotes and coins are, on the one hand, the ideal object of design. They offer themselves for an introductory course for visual semiotics, for example, because for centuries they've kept more or less stable formal and material qualities, metal, paper, and plastic. So it's a study like heraldry, like the study of epigraphs, the study of flags, right? The studies with more or less stable objects. Virginia Hewitt, who you have mentioned and you have studied, has definitely done a really interesting job on the influence of decoration types, of aesthetic motifs, and their transference onto paper and their cultural inscriptions. But this aspect, like the design aspect of banknotes and coins, just proves that they are the least prone to change, the least open to interpretation, right? Now, on the other hand, coins and banknotes are an object of economy. And the two have very little to do with each other. I mean, as an object of design, it does not refer to exchange, barter, finance, to its status as an object of economy. So this is the basic contradiction, semiotic contradiction. And Christian Bankhoff, in his 2022 article, has given us this really nice idea about the analogy of the currency and the linguistic sign, the Saussurean linguistic sign, right? I found that a really fascinating, really interesting idea. So as an object of economy, it's also a ritual expression, a measure of these fleeting qualities of debt, of exchange, of barter, in studies of like urban anthropology, history, to this day, where nation states are no longer the real units of power and its currency. It is a different thing to say that these designs have meaning, and another thing to say that in capitalism, for example, money is everything. So it imposes a general equivalence, like a rationale on everything: goods, services, resources, energies, ideas. And the banknotes and the coins try to divert us from this idea, from this reality. And we can say the same thing about Bitcoin and digital currencies that exploit this amazing arbitrariness of the general equivalence, which means everything that can be bought and sold. So how do we reconcile these two really strong semiotic let's say groundings of currency? I have the sense it's not just a plane of expression and a plane of content that are like design qualities that are at play here. Maybe we could think of this through a third strand of thought, the links between religious iconography and the iconography of emperors, kings, statesmen, like political iconography, let's say, right up to today's civil society and all the amazing examples that you've given us. I'm thinking of the Canadian example that you so aptly analyze. For example, religious iconography and nation-state symbolism in Christian states have always been intertwined, like majority Christian nation states, Europe, US, Latin America, have developed a close relationship to the churches from the beginning. So this is not so much a question of politics and religion, but of how the kind of religious legitimations and strategies, rhetorics, design, visual symbolism, all that kind of thing, has been used by monarchs, by aristocrats, and then by national assemblies, parliaments, congresses, that are clearly borrowed from the church. Of course, one can say early Christian symbols were also borrowed by Roman and the Greco-Roman symbols, etc. It goes back. So I think what we need here is a cultural socio-cultural analysis, as you say, but it needs to have a strong historical angle so as to not so much reconcile, but to think at the same time on how these two aspects of the banknote might produce some interesting thoughts, right? Why the design? Why does it say nothing about currency? And to make my point clearer, I think Evripidis Andidis will understand what I mean, because he's done a lot of work on logos. Design of banknotes is not open-ended, dynamic. It's not a dynamic meaning-making process. It's not open to change compared to other circumstances of mass communication, like logos for the corporate world. I mean, of course, states are also brands nowadays because they operate in a similar way. But to establish that, we need a historical socio-cultural angle, I think, right? To see where this break is more apparent and to what other factors it is related. Is it clear? My basic question is, what is your definition of the political? Because it's not the dynamic or the changing, because in banknotes, there's no such thing in the design aspect of it. There's a dynamic process going on in the values and in the currency that they represent. But that's a different semiotic approach. Somehow, it is such a fascinating subject matter, the one you've chosen, that opens up all these really broad questions about the history of culture and the creation of value, both economic and cognitive visual value. I think it brings these really big concepts together. It's really hard what you've chosen to study. That's what I'm mainly actually saying.
Thank you for your intervention. Now let's hear Euripides Sentides from the Cyprus University. He's head of the Department of Multimedia and Graphic Art, and he's a specialist in graphic communication.
Thank you, Monica, and congratulations, Sebastian, and thank you for your fascinating talk. I agree with what has already been said, and I built on Leah's argument and discussion on the examination of the historical context behind the socio-cultural analysis that you have been developing. As well as say at the same time how mesmerized we are from your corpus. You have an amazing corpus of mirrors, reflections of societies and nations and cultures that I think if you ever thought of examining each country's currency, you could be making one book for each currency. They are so much rich with information, and if you like study the origins for any of the corpus of the notes you have shown us, you would be making lots and lots of books. And some of them are so rich, and some of them you can really understand the history of graphic design behind them, especially the Swiss, which differentiate themselves from the rest of the corpus. They have amazing colors and compositions and fascinating layouts. I would say if you examine a more micro-semiotic perspective to details like typeface design and shapes, as well as placement, orientation, of course, color and the plastic signs that you have mentioned, you would be probably confirming more hypotheses and assumptions that you have done regarding the connotative contribution of banknotes, as well as the banal nationalistic dimensions that they serve, especially if you are a bit more strict with the iconic signs, the non-verbal ones, where you could be looking the representation of these figures and the way that they are positioned or where the gaze of their eyes are, as well as any other graphic shapes and flora or fauna that are accompanied with them. A lot of semiotic conclusions derive from the hierarchy of information and the way that designers want us to look at banknotes, where to start from and go through a specific path of probably nationalistic signs that tell definitely a story. What I would be interested to hear more is whether you are aware of any designs that were used as political propaganda. They were used as manipulating ideologies or excluding cultural narratives because of socio-political changes in these countries, as well as a totally different question regarding, we often come across the rise of conspiracy theories, especially from specific triggering signs that are associated with, like theories that are not valid, or they have all this conspiratorial rhetoric behind them. I congratulate you, and I think you have a wonderful corpus. Also, sometimes I would add in the semiosphere the way that time is used metaphorically, like time is also a metaphor of money. Time is money. We say things like that, as well as it can be a metaphor of power and influence, like money talks or buying power. It can be also a metaphor of morality when we talk about dirty money or clear money. And maybe we can see how these dimensions are also visualized in the graphic design language of the banknotes, and see what other metaphoric dimensions can have other than their exchange value. Thank you very much for this presentation, and looking forward to your book.
Thank you very much. Okay, now let's call Chris Arney. He's the founder of Creative Semiotics in London.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, thanks very much, Sebastian, for your excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm meaning to get hold of your book on populism as well. I guess maybe the political environment is a bit depressing at the moment, so I'm having to sort of ration my news. So maybe the last thing I want to do is dip into looking at the antecedents. But as semioticians, I think we also need to understand the world. So I'm sure it's excellent. So I'm sure I will get a chance. I mean, what a fantastic topic. Banknotes are semioticians' playground, and I've actually got a collection of banknotes in a sort of box of places I've been, places I'm going to return to, and I've been looking at them. And I think one of the things about semiotics is that we, hopefully as semioticians, we help to estrange things that are familiar to people, that maybe they overlook the signs. And so I have a British banknote here. And it's incredible that there's sort of an assemblage of signs, so many different signs and many different layers of signs. You know, there's the watermark at the back. There's this, the sort of various transparencies, and it's an incredibly complex, in a way, semiotic text. Whilst on the other hand, being quite formalized and kind of rubric with potentially some substitutable aspects that you can kind of expect to see across different national currencies. And I thought you brought that out really well, really nicely. Yeah, I mean, I guess I have. I mean, I think I'd probably like to think a bit more about it. I've just got a couple of areas that I'm interested in. I suppose what I mostly do in my line of work is undertake projects for commercial clients or agencies and brands, and I do, I have a corpus of materials and analyze them. Depending on the project, use different types of semiotic theory and approach. I guess for me, one thing that struck me is that you can think about branding as an industry as kind of going in some sort of a sort of almost Persian trajectory from the indexical, potentially, towards something that's more iconic through the symbolic era. So obviously, brands started off as marks of origin and provenance. The marking of property and in terms of cattle marking, earmarking, the hallmarking and of sort of objects, art objects, utensils, silver marking, and that's where the word sort of branding comes from. But obviously, then branding then arguably from the 1890s through the 1950s, the high watermark of sort of aspirational branding, brands through advertising sought to sort of attach themselves to various sorts of positive association to do with lifestyle, social status. And then from the sort of 80s, 90s onwards, we had a sort of identity revolution. It was much more about individual identity and sort of conceptual branding. And yeah, what I saw in the banknotes that you presented, in a way, you can see some sort of a trajectory of change. You obviously you showed the highly indexical marks of sort of, I guess, artistic attainment, but also in neoclassical. You talked about Art Nouveau. I saw a lot of neoclassical sort of, I guess, a pastiche, if in a way, of sort of neo-baroque, neoclassical sort of framing motifs, aspects of, I guess, historicist design, you could call it, for argument's sake. But that's very much a kind of aesthetic tradition of the 19th century, and that roots the currencies in a certain sort of authoritative tradition, as Roman was talking about. And then some of the more modern contemporary inflections and new schemas, new visual schemas, are a lot more open. They are less in hoc to these historicist traditions. They're more in about sort of contemporary graphic design. I wouldn't quite say going into emotional design, but I would think I'm a big fan of Robert Jacobson's communicative function. I do think sort of thinking about the phatic, thinking about the connotative, because I would say the root of such banknotes are very much about the referential. Just like the broadsheet as a newspaper is a fundamentally referential genre compared to the tabloid, which is more connotative, it's sensationalist, it's soft news, it's not in the national interest necessarily, the stories. And you could apply a similar thing, and I think that traditional banknotes are very much in the broadsheet. So I think that looking at the use of iconic signs, and is there a change? The indexical's here, but in the future, do we need these signatures? Do we need these sort of long numbers? Will that just be QR codes or some sort of much more smaller digital mechanism, and therefore there's a bigger part of the frame can be given over to sort of building an identitarian signs, kind of cultural codes, ways of expressing things, which leads me on to really my second and probably only real point beyond that, which is the idea of branding and nation branding and soft power. Having done a little bit of research and being just massively fascinated by the Olympic Games opening ceremonies, I just think they are the semiotic playground par excellence, in my opinion, on the global stage. But you could see sort of national currencies as a slightly less, that it's not the society of the spectacle. It's obviously a more persistent but less obviously exuberant expression of national identity for obvious reasons. Are there countries that are using these as the site of nation branding and expressing the soft power of the nation in a way that's more effective than the others? For example, if you think about what attracts visitors to come to the UK, it is our cultural heritage, it is our art galleries, our incredible theatre land, our creators, our writers, our creativity, our IP. So it's probably no coincidence that I would be very surprised if that hadn't had some influence in, putting Turner and Jane Austen on the back. And is there a way you can correlate that somehow with the, the soft power Because I agree that obviously then the national ideological shifts have a huge influence. I'm surprised that Gandhi is still on the Indian banknotes, for example. I don't know if that he is, but I'll be very surprised if he stays on there if the current political climate stays. But I would also say look into the cultural heritage, the cultural strategies of nations and how they influence banknotes. That could be really interesting. But otherwise, I'm sure you've got enough on your plate and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's hear now Tiago Müller. He's professor of neuromarketing at the Catholic University Dom Bosco in Mato Grosso do Sul, Brazil.
Hello, Sebastian. Thank you one more time for your speech. I guess it's so fantastic. Actually, I want to read your book, The Social Semiotic of Populism, and I had the opportunity to read your paper, La Definición of Populism. I'm sorry for my bad Spanish because I can't. As you know, everybody here in Brazil, most of people can talk in Portuguese or Spanish. But when I read this paper and when I pay attention about your speech today, I was thinking about two questions, two specific questions to ask about you. So the first one is the governments use money design to control precipitation or social behavior. What do you think about this? And what is the biggest challenge in design money? Security, culture, or public perception? I guess both questions we can have a conversation more deeply about your paper and I guess about your book that I want to read too. So once again, congratulations for your speech and thank you for everything.
Okay, thank you. Now let's hear our last panelist for today, Christian Bankov, professor of semiotics at the New Bulgarian University in Sofia and editor-in-chief of Digital Age in Semiotics and Communication.
Thank you, Veronica. So I had the privilege to read the book of Sebastian, and it's a very rich and exciting book. I'm a great supporter of this work, and I'm so happy that now the discourse on money is promoted and more semioticians are interested in it. I have some theoretical observations, very short. I will try to be very short in sharing them with you. Probably part of them I have already shared with Sebastian. So about the paradoxical state, which Leah Yock mentioned, I would try to put my version on her questions. Sign and text. Now the money sign, the banknotes actually are at the same time sign and a text. They are signed because they're main function to exchange, store, and express money value is it would be sufficient to have just a number on a piece of paper, and this would be sufficient to signify the economic value, providing that there are limited number, etc. But this added value makes the money text. I mean, the money sign has always been a playground of some ideological, nationalistic, and other discourses. So it circulates in the culture as a money sign, and it is very established. On the other hand, it's a text. It cannot be reduced to a sign because we have seen how complex symbologies and narratives exist. So this is a kind of paradox and makes the money sign unique and object and justifies such profound work as Sebastian's on the matter. Saying this, I think that the money sign is a kind of VIP transporter which brings things from outside the semiosphere into the core of the semiosphere. I mean, they are established already as a science system in every national economy. There are money, but what you are putting on them, as Chris said, it's a soft power, but sometimes it's not so soft. the origin of design of putting someone's symbology on the money starts from Alexander the Great. He was the first user of the power of money to signify something beyond their monetary value. So his father, Philip II, and Alexander the Great were the first ones to print their faces on the money. And you know how important for the whole military campaigns of Alexander the Great was the fact that he was bringing with him, with the army, the mint, the facility to reproduce money. This was extremely important. It was a combination of the political and economical power of money going together, and that's why he was so successful. And there are many researchers saying how important the fact that he was paying with his own money to these warriors was in order to achieve this success. So money are so-called, they transport something which the one who keeps the power decides to bring it from outside into the core of the semiosphere, because the monetary exchange is in the core of the semiosphere, but it is empty. So it's an empty signifier, and depends what meaning, what soft power, what you decide to put on it. I would say also that there are ideologies which I haven't seen in the book, but I think there's a comment I can put it. Some, let's say, rulers put inner-oriented messages to keep their political power more stable within. Other, like in Finland, certainly it is outer-oriented. So this Sibelius money, I remember, as Roman said, and architects in Finland, they were a very good image of Finland for people from outside, just to enjoy how, let's say, the cultural values in this country are so great. And to conclude, since everybody mentioned the dark times we are entering now, especially in the United States, now where this soft power can go. Chris was speaking about branding and brands and its relations to money sign, but who will be the first one to make this step and to use the, let's say, the vehicle of in the semiosphere, which brings from the outside to the inside, to the core of the semiosphere meanings? Who will be the first one to put brands there? Are we going to see Tesla factory in the next US dollar banknote instead of the, I don't know, Lincoln Memorial? Okay, this is a joke, but still kind of question to reflect upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. Now let's hear Sebastian answering all these questions. And I'm going to add one more question. There are several layers of security added to the banknotes. Do they force to modify visually or to go one way or the other because of the effect that they need to have on the note? Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your feedback, your comments, your appreciation as well, and these very insightful thoughts. I will start, I will try to answer more or less because it's a lot of things. Monica, I start with your question, because it's interesting how whenever you look at paratexts, so websites of the central banks and so on, trying to explain why design is being changed, the usual excuse is security. Yeah, for example, abandoning this fabric of cotton and linen, 75% cotton and 25% linen, for polymer. This has to do with the conservation of the banknote, right? I cannot tear apart a banknote of polymer. I need to deliberately get a scissor and cut it, but I can accidentally tear off a piece of that one. So normally the justification is based on new security measures, holograms, translucid strips, and so on and so on and so on, as Chris showed very clearly in the holograms or the translucid windows of the UK pound sterling. If that is the real argument, or the real reason, we cannot know. This can also be used as a cover-up for other changes. On the dark times, and I go to Christian's joke, but not so joke, because on the Canadian dollar, we saw the Dexter Arm or these spaceships on the 100 Canadian dollars. We have someone with a microscope. So it's not very hard to imagine a couple of times if Trump administration continues to having Teslas and hyperlink and all these kind of innovations that could be used from the political power in turn to show the puissance, the power of how great America is. I don't want to live in that world, but it can happen, right? And on the US dollar, again, going a bit back to Roman's comment, there was an initiative, there was a social movement to remove, I think it was in the $20 note, to remove Jackson from the $20 note because he was a slave trade and so on, and replace him with a woman. Yeah, and there was a consultation, and the government had agreed before the first Trump administration to replace that man with Harriet Tubman, yeah, who has particular connotations in the United States. This was agreed, this was approved, and when Trump took office the first time, everything was removed for evident reasons that unfortunately we are still confirming and confirming since he took office for the second time. As a more general, trying to sum up many of the comments particularly by colleagues' experience in art and brands and history. Of course, one book could be written for every country, right? This idea of currency design or my interest for currency design is just the first steps into a bigger, a broader interest that I have and I had for many time. That is the semiotics of national identity. Can you what? Can you hear me well? Because I see that I'm turning off the camera 1 second so it gets better. So I have an interest in the semiotics of national identity, and actually I have already discussed this with some members of the panel to use the forum of the International Association for Semiotic Studies to have a working group on this, on trying to analyze different state symbols and how the idea of nationality is being expressed and so on and so on. Yeah, and this is actually what interests me, is trying to understand how the idea of a collective identity linked to the nation can be or is constructed in discourse and using semiosis. So one book could be written for every currency. The historical dimension is absolutely interesting and relevant, but the purpose of this particular book is to try to inspire researchers, particularly people on master level, PhD level, and so on, to try to look at the currencies they have around and try to do what I do with a couple. I study 8 currencies in the book. Yeah, so of course, also I think the advances in semiotic series of Bloomsbury, where the book will be published, has this idea of bringing semiotics out of semiotic circles and trying to make it useful for people studying visual studies, cultural studies, and multimodal studies. So I'm also trying to be very simple and basic and avoiding terminology and so on as much as I can in the analysis, so that people don't get lost in all the textual analysis methodology. Wait, let's see if the camera is working now. No, it's slow. On religious discourses, Lia, you mentioned this. It's very interesting because the inscription "In God We Trust" is the only inscription that you find in every single currency unit of the United States dollar. Not even the name of the country. You don't have the name of the country, or maybe you do, I don't remember, but you have the inscription in banknotes and in coins. So this mediation of religious discourse is very interesting, because you will not find that in the Uruguayan peso, because Uruguay is a secular state, that there is no official religion, right? So the mediation of these kind of things is interesting. On the coins of the pound sterling, besides the profile portrait of the monarch, you have a Latin inscription, something like the gracious God for the king. I don't remember the translation, but these discourses that have been long related to the state mediate in currency design. So in general, to all your comments, I have noted them. I have thought of many of these things, not of all of them, but I thought of many of these about many of these things. But at some point, I had to decide what I wanted to do with this book. And as you clearly said, many thanks, Christian, for joining and for your feedback on the project you're leading. At some point, I had to decide what I wanted to do with this book, and I think that the spirit of the project and the book is the same as I had in my previous 2 books, one on populism, one on the COVID-19 pandemic. It's trying to show how everyday life can be approached using a semiotic perspective clearly based on textual analysis. We analyze things. We analyze specific things. In the case of the pandemic, depictions of the coronavirus as a monster, the murals of the healthcare workers as heroes or superheroes. So all these things that people encounter because they are social beings inhabiting a semiosphere produce worldviews, express worldviews, and this is a bit what I wanted to do. This has been the most interesting or the easiest book to write because the corpus is clearly delimited. I decided that I was going to work with the latest series of the currencies I chose and eventually go back on time, for example, to show when Britannia appeared for the first time, what was the context in the case of Brazil, when the Republic appeared in the evidence, and so on. But of course, everything is there still to be done, right? So that's why the idea of a semiotics of national identity is something that I really, really would like to develop in the near future, and ideally in close collaboration with colleagues from around the world. So this can really be a collaborative. I'm looking at my notes here and want to steal much time. On cognition, on Romance, first comment, of course, these cognitive frames are very interesting, but at some point I had to draw a line, right? And thank you for the reference of George Lakoff. I know his work, and it's very interesting as well to think of currency with this, because we know that the banknotes of the US dollar will be redesigned starting next year and gradually, and I'm looking forward to see what will happen. Right? Are we having something like in Canada? Is Franklin still going to be the main portrait of the $100, or someone will come with an idea that is different? I don't think that during the Trump administration much will change. And this shows, and going back to Leah's question on the definition of the political, right? This is what happens, and what is interesting for us, people or semioticians working with culture and society. Something that looks innocent, that expresses economic value, as you will say, and as Christians, of course, studied and clearly argued. Something that expresses economic value is there for other purposes linked to what we study, right? So whatever Trump does, if he takes the lead to redesign the banknotes of the US dollar, can be read in light of all his semiotic discourse, all his semiotic strategies to produce a particular stance or take of the America, the USA that he thinks he is standing for and he is representing, right? And a comment on this, because Ana Maria Loruso from the University of Bologna wrote a short opinion, editorial op-ed, an editorial in an Italian newspaper, where she commented that the clash between Zelensky and Trump from the 28th of February was precisely because Zelensky tried to tell Trump that the America wouldn't be great because they would feel the effects of the war. Yeah, and she makes a beautiful analysis saying why Donald Trump lost it, because someone who is not American was putting his semiotic strategy in danger by saying all the things you are promising are not going to happen. America is not going to be great again if you don't interfere or you become friends with Vladimir Putin and so on. So yes, all these things are open, and I hope this can only be the starting point for a collaborative work, for a common work between all of us in these things that are very much needed in a world that unfortunately is going back to rhetorics of nationalism and of division. This is something, of course, doesn't work in the world we live in. Colleagues, I hope I have answered more or less all the points. If not, I'm very happy to follow up bilaterally, of course, and I thank you again for your inputs and for being here.
Thank you so much for your fruitful insights, and I think we had fun and we learned a lot. And I want to thank all the panelists. And a last thanks was very special to Paul Buissac, who puts together these Smart Semiotics seminars, and also for Zygmunt for his technical support. So I hope to see you in the next web seminar. Bye, everybody.
Many thanks.